Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 17th chapter in the book of Job. This is the second chapter of Job's fifth speech. The first time we hear from him is in chapter 3, and that's after losing everything all at once. Completely unrelatable and scarcely imaginable scenario of him losing his health, his wealth, and his family in rapid succession, and all because Yahweh consents to a challenge from Satan that if he took all these things from him, he would blaspheme him to his face. And it's after a 7-day period when his 3 friends from Edomite territory gather with him, and they spend 7 days mourning and in stunned silence. And then Job burst out in Chapter 3, then we hear from the comforters in the order in which they are presented. In chapter 2, verse 11, we hear from Eliphaz from the 4th to 5th chapter. Then Job's second speech is chapter 6 and 7. Then we hear from Bildad the Shuhite, then in the 8th chapter, and then Job in 9 and 10. And then we hear from Zophar the Naamanite in chapter 11, and then Job 12, 13, 14. 12, 13, and 14 is his fourth address. So he responds to them to 3, and then it returns back to Eliphaz, the one in whom he began. The book of Job is an exchange of monologues which are taking place, and it's really 3 against 1. It's these 3 comforters all towing the same party line, which stubbornly insists that Job's suffering was in proportion and deserved from some sin he had committed, some sin he was keeping secret, because as they saw it, their black and white archaic theological prism is that suffering is always related to sin, and without sin there would be no suffering. But the fact in the existence of suffering in the righteous is the theme of theodicy, unto the genre of which this book belongs. But Job, Eliphaz gets a lot more personal in his language. He is frustrated and impatient at Job's seeming inability to process the superior arguments of him and the 2 others. So he gets a lot more personal, and Job responds in the 16th chapter. He calls them comforters of trouble, more alternately translated as miserable comforters. And he says in verse 4 and 5, I might also speak like you if you were in my place. I might heap up words against you and shake any head at you. I might strengthen you with my mouth, and my moving lips might bring relief. So he's imagining if the shoe was on the other foot. That's something they were not doing. They did not empathize with him as a friend. They did not have compassionate concern. They came as critical judges rather than offering counsel, comfort, and healing. But he's saying, he has 2 options. He could do the same thing that he was doing, but having lived and experienced and seen that no lasting good can come from it, he'd rather edify and uplift and encourage and bring healing and health with his words, bring relief, because that's the one thing he really needed, because he was wearied and by his torments. And then he starts speaking of Elohim in the 8th verse, and we're going to read the 9th verse. So he's addressing his friends. He's calling them worthless comforters, worthless quacks. He elsewhere calls them miserable comforters, and then he takes personal being the targeted the targeted object of Yahweh's wrathful retribution. He has torn in his wrath, and he hates me. He has gnashed at me with his teeth. My adversary sharpens his eyes upon me. So the only explanation for this inexplicable suffering that Job could muster is that he had Yahweh hated him, and he couldn't quite figure out the reason, because he had loved him and he obeyed him. Even now he would not forsake him by blaspheming him, but he does erroneously suppose and assume that the suffering that is inflicted upon him is sent but from Elohim. We don't even read that his friends mention the name of Satan, but he is present in the first 2 chapters. So there is something supernatural in effect, but Job doesn't categorically consider that it could be the evil one who we learn is subjected to the limitations of the supremely sovereign one. I was at ease, but he broke me up, and he took me by my neck and shattered me, and he stood me up for his target. This is verse 12. So Job was living the good life. He was rewarded in proportion to his righteousness. He had a hedge of protection. He had possessions. He had a large family. He had influence and respect in the town that he wielded, but he lost it all, and he is just this was 8 days ago, so the sting is still fresh. And he describes him as just being manhandled by him, and he is once more his targeted object of his wrath. Verse 16, my face is reddened with weeping, and on my eyelids the shadow of death, though no evidence was on my hand, and my prayer sincere. So the suffering that he was feeling, he did not feel that he was proportionate to any sin he had committed. You know, he has faith in the integrity and purity of his prayers, and that he thought no violence, he inflicted no violence, he meant no harm, he gave no harm to anyone else, and yet he is being harmed right now. He is on the verge of death. He's praying for it in the day that he not only curses the day he was born, but wishes it had never been. He not only wishes for death, but curses the day that he was born and wishes that he would never been born. Verse 21, oh, that one might plead for a man with Eloah, as a man with his neighbor. So he feels bereft of a mediator or counselor or advocate, but this is faith. He does mention a mediator in the 19th chapter, especially we read of his witness and testimony, a prelude to the resurrection. We're going to take it from the 17th chapter, verse 1, lesson itself. My spirit has been broken, my days have been extinguished, graves are for me. To be broken of spirit is just to want to give it all up, hang in the cleats, toss in the towel, and just roll over and play dead. That is Job's current state of dejection. He feels broken. He has no hope, no motivation, nothing to live for. His spirit is shattered by the affliction that was visited upon him. And, you know, he's still alive, but he doesn't really consider himself. This is not life as he likes it, not life as he knows it. So he feels that his best days are behind him. It's only going to get worse. And he is destined for death. He's at the door of the grave, and he's just longing for the sweet release of death from life, because life is not worth living. And as he sees it now, having experienced what he is now experiencing and having gone what he's gone through, this is his conclusion. Truly, mockeries are with me, and my eye rests on their insults. So no one feels good when they are being insulted, but Paul advises us in the 12th chapter of 2 Corinthians. He says that he rejoices in insults, hardships, afflictions. We have to, and mockery is part of the Christian's life, but it's adding insult to injury when a man is as low to the dust and as humbled to the ground as is Job, to be mocked for his condition, saying, haha, look at you, you have no one to blame but yourself. That is how he's interpreting the arguments of his friends who aren't very friendly, his comforters who aren't exactly comforting, and his counselors who are providing no valid counsel. So insults are inappropriate because here's a man wounded in need of healing and restoration, and they are just pouring salt on the wounds, adding insult to injury. Because he's been injured to the T. That is no understatement or exaggeration. He was physically injured. He lost his family. He lost his wealth. And he had miserable skin boils, head to toe. Please lay down a pledge for me with yourself. Who would strike hands with me? So the yourself is capitalized. By that we know that he is speaking to divinity. El Shaddai is the nomenclature of preference, appearing 31 times throughout the book of Job. He's introduced as Yahweh in the opening chapter, but it's only in 12:9, I think it is, that Job uses the covenant name of Yahweh. And it's curious because these are not Jews by birth. They live in Edomite territory, and Job pre-existed Moses historically. Job, the writing of Job also pre-exists the writing of the Pentateuch, creation itself. This is the oldest, and no one knows who wrote it, but it is believed to be dated from the patriarchal era. For you have hidden their hearts from understanding, therefore you do not exalt them. So he's accusing his friends of the same thing they accused him, of having an ignorance or lack of knowledge. And he says, the mind cannot understand what the ear will not hear what the heart is not first willing and prepared to comprehend. So he opens our hearts, but if he hides our hearts from understanding, that means we have no means of attaining that knowledge or advancing in wisdom, and we will be knowledge and wisdom is a path to exaltation. It certainly enhances experience in this life that we know. He who denounces friends for a share, even the eyes of his children shall fail. So he's saying, you're going to get your due because you're denouncing me. He is speaking to his friends, who had denounced him, for a share. They hadn't profited financially, but they were profiting at his expense from his suffering. They were insulting him, or that's how he was perceiving the harshness of their words. They were unnecessarily harsh, and they were not even true, because Job's experience invalidated the overly simplistic premise that suffering is the deserved due in proportion to the sin, because he was he wasn't sinless, but he wasn't living in sin, and he certainly didn't have any secret sin that was unconfessed. And even though Job did not suffer because he sinned in his suffering. He is guilty of self-righteous on a few occasions, but so too are his friends, even greater. They are walking in perfect health with their wealth intact, and they are denouncing their friends whose fortune had suddenly been lost. But that's not gonna. The consequences and curses could be visited upon their children by the law of retribution in Yahweh's economy and justice system. But he has made me a byword of the people, whereas in former times I was as a drum. So this isn't going to happen because Job is the personal object. He's the only one in the world, and he can't understand why the maker of the heavens and earth has a personal vendetta against him. So to be reduced to a byword, alternately translated as proverb, is to be a figure of fun, a figure of ridicule, by rumor of your rumor-induced reputation is one that is deflated. He's longing for the old days. In former times I was as a drum. So to be a drum is to have might and majesty and strength, whereas to be a proverb or a byword is a weakness. And from sorrow my eye has grown dim, and all my members are like shadows. So this is a tragedy, what had been visited upon him. Eventually the book of Job turns from a tragedy into a comedy. Comedy not in the sense that it is humorous, but that it does have a happy ending. And the sorrow is just overwhelming right now. His eyes are red, swollen from tears, and his eyes have grown dim. And all his members, the physical consequences of his emotional and spiritual dejection are adversely affected. So his body is a shadow of its former self. It is alive but barely functioning. It's in pain. It's what happened to my health. I used to be able to walk without having the pain and the stigma of terrible skin boils from head to toe. Upright ones are astonished at this, and the innocent stirs himself against the defiled one. This is the first and certainly not the last resort to sarcasm right here. So he's calling his friends upright, even though they are, less than upright, at least in their present situation, in their critical, judgmental treatment of their friend Job. They were amazed, and and the innocent one stirs him against the defiled one, so he considers himself innocent, and he has to defend his innocence to people who were less than innocent from a moral standpoint, but because they still had their health and their wealth and everything, their prosperity and respect, they were defiled. They were still defiled. They were guilty of the sins of the spirit, which is harboring hatred for those who even allegedly are guilty of the sins of the flesh. And the righteous holds to his way, and he has been clear hands, become stronger and stronger. Now 8 and 9 seem almost out of place in the narrative sequence, but when we understand that he is resorting to sarcasm, and this is sometimes ridicule is the only righteous response, and he feels justified in this measure by the folly of his friends, and he's holding. They're holding to their way. They're stubbornly unwilling to detach themselves from the basic premise of their argument, was that Job was a sinner, and his suffering was because he deserved it through sin. And he would like them, the righteous is a mock term of mock deference. They're being less than righteous. But he, and their hands are not entirely clean. They were guilty of the sin of the spirit in his midst, and they were growing stronger and stronger, more boastful, more arrogant, more personal in their vendetta against him. Overwhelmingly so. But please come back again, all of you, for I do not find a wise one among you. This is also semi-sarcastic. He's longing for their return, but, to no avail, because they do not have the wisdom. He's made it plain in other verses that he's heard everything they said. They don't have, that their words are their own, but their ideas are stubbornly unoriginal. They are wholly derivative from a systematic theology which is bound by the shackles of its very system. But Job belongs in the category of wisdom literature, so this is a lesson, and suffering and affliction teaches us everything we know. And pleasure and prosperity, we have no similar educative potential. So we are made wise through our suffering, and one of the marks of wise people is their willing and eager embrace of discipline. In one of the other books of Old Testament wisdom literature, the book of Proverbs. My days have passed by, my plans have been broken off, the desires of my heart. So he had dreams, hopes, aspirations, and expectations, but they all instantly evaporated and vanished when all this affliction came suddenly visited upon him in severe intensity, the extremity of which there is nothing relatable in any ordinary human experience. This was an extraordinary chain of events, and just to be questioning, where is Yahweh in all this, and why is he against me, could only be a traumatic experience for one who had been rewarded in proportion to his righteousness. But, Job's plans, his main, he just wants to die right now. He doesn't have much hope. He doesn't have any expectation. He's expecting to go down to the grave, but he also says, I know my Redeemer lives, in the 19th chapter. So Job does, as these speeches, as the narrative unfolds, Job's speeches do get progressively more hopeful. So in the 3rd chapter, his first speech, he's just wishing for death. He's cursing the day that he was born. He wishes he had never been born. but his hopes, expectations, and aspirations he has given up on, and he's ready to give up on life itself at this point. They put night as day, that light is near in the face of darkness. So night as day, that is confusion, because ordinarily the sun rises in the day, but to have it go down at night could only be confusion. But he's also speaking of the darkness of his own confusion and doubt at this moment. He doubts the very reason for living in righteousness, if this is what it got him, and he's confused as to why it all happened. Why, I did not deserve this, so why am I feeling it? Why is Yahweh aligned against me? Why has he reckoned me as his enemy? And he longs for his day in court, and he eventually gets it. If I wait, the grave is in my house. I shall make my bed in darkness. So because he's enraptured in darkness, he has no choice but to sleep in it. And he's preparing for the grave, the ultimate place and destination of darkness, Sheol, hell. And in hell, you're just in the outer darkness, disembodied, your immortal soul, left to linger in essential solitude. But he feels that the grave is my house. He's more comfortable there than he is living at this point, and he just longs for the sweet release from life that can come from death. I say to corruption, you are my father. To the worm, you are my mother and my sister. So he feels a close connection and blood relation to corruption and worm. Corruption is now our bodies, our physical bodies, their corruption results in the deterioration and death. But he feels that he is the son of corruption. He was born in, and he feels the corruption and the lack of physical vitality and health. And worm is the basest creature of the dirt. It is an unflattering designation, and we become worm food. When we are made of dust, we return to dust. And he's feeling right at home. He calls it his mother and his sister. These are people he knows, people he's comfortable with. He considers himself equal to a worm in his present situation. Where then is my hope? As for my hope, who would see it? Job certainly can't see it. He's feeling hopeless, helpless. He all his plans, dreams, and aspirations had given up on, and he's ready to give up on life. And he's just hoping, what he hopes for earlier is just for, a blissful interlude where he can enjoy life without the pain that he has before he goes out to eternal death and darkness. So Job does get progressively more optimistic in all his answers. He is stunned in silence, and he repents in response to when Yahweh visits him. So he does get his hope for day in court, but he doesn't even get a chance to rebuttal. He does not make the same points that he makes to his friends when he is in the awesome presence of the Almighty. 16th and final verse. Would it sink down to the grave? Would we together go down into the dust? He's ready to go down in the grave. He's certainly prepared to. He certainly longs for it, and he feels right at home in the grave. He has a natural affinity, which is more than an abstract one, or at the very least at this point abstract, but he's hoping to take it beyond the abstract level. He's hoping to make death and his existence in reality. And to the dust we were made of dust, and to the dust we will return. And physically speaking, our bodies do become worm food, but we also have a spiritual nature, which, if we accept the Messiah as our Savior, we can be resurrected and have perfected bodies that are not subjectable to decay or corruption, and we will not be hindered by sin in the new heaven, new earth, and new Jerusalem, which awaits us. That's getting a little far outside the text. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.